Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and on behalf of the Institute of Politics and for all the Kennedy School, I want to welcome you here tonight. Part of our mission here at the Kennedy School is to bring academics and policymakers together to address the ways in which government works and how it can serve the public interest. And this forum is our most public venue for that dialogue. So we're particularly pleased and honored tonight to welcome back New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. Last year, Mayor Giuliani was here and spoke about immigration, which he defended as America's single biggest key to success. And tonight, he's going to talk about the new urban agenda. Mr. Mayor, we're delighted to have you back. Tonight's forum event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics, the Student Advisory Committee, and the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. The Taubman Center is the home to the Kennedy School's research programs on housing, transportation, and urban affairs, education, as well as two quite interesting special projects, the Saguaro Seminar on Civic Engagement, directed by Robert Putnam, and the Innovations Program, directed by Alan Altshuler. New York City has won 2 Innovations Awards under Mayor Giuliani's leadership and is a finalist for 2 more in this year's competition. A recent New Yorker article praises Mayor Giuliani's nimble, at times uncanny political skills, his widely acclaimed success in reducing crime, the welfare rolls, and improving the quality of life in New York City will soon be up to its voters to assess as to whether he gets an award. But whether it's the Innovations Award or the Mayoral Award, it's going to be an exciting autumn for New York City. And now, to introduce Mayor Giuliani, I'd like to ask Alan Altshuler to take over. Alan is the director of the Taubman Center. He's the Ruth and Frank Stanton Professor of Urban Policy and Planning here at the Kennedy School. He was just last week inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a distinguished teacher and scholar, began his career in urban planning at MIT, was former Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, then moved to New York, where he was Dean of the Wagner School at NYU, before returning to us here in Cambridge in 1988 to be the founding director of the Taubman Center. Alan.
Joe, thank you very much. For all students of public policy and politics, there's a special awe about the office of the mayor of New York City. The scale of the city, its history, its diversity, its challenges seem colossal. 7.5 million people, scores of racial, ethnic, and language groups, more than 1,000 public schools, a city university, a municipal budget of more than $33 billion this year. No wonder that the office of mayor has often attracted colossal personalities as well, from Fiorello LaGuardia in the 1930s to our speaker this evening, whose energy, whose imagination, independence, and tenacity have really riveted the attention of all serious students of American politics in recent years. Let me note just a few highlights from Mayor Giuliani's long and distinguished record of public service. He's a native New Yorker. He graduated from Manhattan College and from New York University Law School. In 1970, he joined the office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. At age 29, he was named chief of the narcotics unit and rose to serve as executive U.S. Attorney. Then he spent several years in private practice, then returned to the Justice Department as Associate Attorney General at the beginning of the Reagan administration. In 1983, he was appointed U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where he attracted national attention for his many significant prosecutions of drug dealers, organized crime figures, and Wall Street inside traders. As mayor, he's presided over the most dramatic drop in crime in the city's history. The city's murder rate has actually fallen by half since 1993, to the lowest level in more than 3 decades. Additionally, he's closed a budget gap that exceeded $2.3 billion on an annualized basis when he took office. He's maintained good union relations even while reducing the city's workforce by more than 17,000 employees. And he's provided the leadership that has enabled his administration to be in the vanguard of policy and public management nationally. Just to give you a sense, a little beyond what Dean Nye was saying about the Innovations in American Government program, we have 10 winners of $100,000 awards issued by the Ford Foundation each year. In each of the past, and they can be won by innovative programs at any level of government, federal, state, or local. Each of the last 2 years, one of the 10 has been won by New York City. And this year we have 25 finalists. The winners will be announced next week. And 2 of those 25 are New York City programs again. So this is really a remarkable performance for any single jurisdiction. Finally, our speaker this evening is, to put it mildly, one of the less predictable major figures in American politics. A lifelong Republican, he astonished most observers by endorsing Mario Cuomo in the 1994 New York State gubernatorial race. And last year in this forum, he staked out a position on immigration policy that was certainly out of step with legislation that the Republican Congress had just passed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to introduce the 107th Mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I left my speech in the car. I did. I got up here and I didn't realize where my speech was, so I was thinking maybe I'll give it without reading the speech, so that's what I'll do. Because I find it, actually when I read a speech I get bored, so I'll stay a lot more interested if I tell you what really occurs to me, and then we spend as much time with your asking questions as possible. I have to correct 2 things that you said, David, just 2 things. One, we've reduced the workforce in New York City not by 17,000, but 24,000. And second, I'm not a lifelong Republican. I began my life as nothing, really. When you're first born, you're neither a Republican nor a Democrat. Most people in Congress don't accept that. But then whenever it was time for me to register to vote, I registered originally as a Democrat, and then I became an independent, and then I became a Republican. So I have still some possibilities left, but I don't like to think of what those fringe parties might be that I could possibly join. And I will tell you, veering a little bit from what I was going to talk about, but we'll eventually get to it, that I think it's very important for a mayor particularly to be independent, particularly the mayor of a very, very large city. I look back when I was running for mayor and thinking about being mayor on the history of the city, and it appeared to me that the city of New York always did better when the mayor was somewhat unpredictable, when the mayor was not a complete captive of one political party or the other. And I thought in this century, the 2 mayors that seemed to me to have had the most success were Fiorello LaGuardia and Ed Koch in representing the interests of the city. Not that I agree with Ed Koch much anymore, but I think he was an excellent mayor of New York City, in part because both of them were independent. Fiorello LaGuardia was a Republican. He was actually the last Republican mayor to be reelected as a Republican mayor of New York City. And he occasionally supported Democrats when he thought it was in the best interest of the city. I think he supported Franklin Roosevelt in at least 1 or possibly 2 of his attempts to be reelected as president, and occasionally would support Democratic candidates for Congress, although most often he would support Republicans. And Ed Koch was kind of like just a reverse of that. Ed Koch was a Democrat, had been a Democratic member of Congress, but when he thought it was wise, sensible, useful, the best thing to do, maybe putting me in the best position to negotiate for the interests of the city, he would feel free to support a Republican, as he did with Al D'Amato in 1986, even though he was a Democratic elected mayor of New York City. The reason I think that's so important, aside from the kind of interest that creates in politics, is when you're the mayor of a city more than any other position, even governor of a state, you have to work with both political parties. America is usually, political power in America is divided, 51-49, 53, maybe 54% Republican or Democrat, but you're going to have Republicans and Democrats in important positions. As the mayor of New York City, I have to deal with a a governor who's a Republican in New York, a Senate that's Republican, but an assembly that's Democratic, a president that's a Democrat, and two houses of Congress that are Republican. It makes sense to be unpredictable. And I won't say anything more about it. You figure it out as to exactly why it does. But to be locked into partisan politics also, I think, doesn't allow you to think clearly. American cities back in the late 1980s and early 1990s were in terrible trouble and in terrible difficulties. And in fact, they were even perceived to be in worse difficulties than they actually were. Magazine articles were written about how cities were declining, cities were finished. There was the front page of Newsweek magazine that was devoted to how New York City was essentially a rotting apple, which didn't make New Yorkers feel very good. And there were local magazines that made the same point, that cities had kind of lost their ability to really be meaningful players in government, and certainly had no capacity to affect the lives of the people that lived in the city in a positive way. In New York City, it would often be described this way. People would just walk around saying, New York City's unmanageable. They just say this. I mean, this was sort of accepted political wisdom. New York City is ungovernable. That was said all through the 1970s, into the 1980s, through the early part of the 1990s. And it reflected itself in both reality and in perception. In reality, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the city was going through a terrible time. It was setting records for murder. Between 1990 and 1993, New York City averaged 2,000 murders a year. There is no other year in history in which New York City ever reached a number like even the lowest number of murders between 1990 and 1993. And similar problems with other areas of crime. Between 90 and 93, we lost 320,000 private sector jobs, which was the greatest job loss that we had had since the Depression. So whether it was a combination of appearance, reality, both happening together, the sense of American cities was that they had reached their fulfillment, and that the most effective things that were happening outside of cities. It troubled me greatly when I ran for mayor of New York City, because I thought it wasn't an adequate reflection of the capacity of a city like New York, or of a city in really civilization. The cities have really marked our culture. Cities really determine, to a very large extent, what people think of us 50 and 100 years later. You know, Athens and Sparta came before Greece. Rome came before Italy. And the city-states of the Renaissance existed before there was a nation of Italy. And in France, I think more people think of Paris than they do of France. And the French government understands that by subsidizing Paris very, very heavily, because of an understanding that as Paris goes, so does the French economy. So, I mean, there's an enormous purpose that cities serve, and really without in any way ignoring other entities, other jurisdictions, other parts of the countries, it really is in cities that our culture is developed. It's in cities in which the plays are performed that are performed 50 and 100 years later. It's in cities that the operas are performed, that people perform for 200 or 300 years. And it's largely in cities in which a culture defines itself. Because, in essence, people of talent, people of creativity in all different fields, can come together. So it seemed to me when I was running for mayor that the real art of being mayor of New York City was to bring that talent, that intelligence to bear on problems. And even though we might have the biggest problems because we had the biggest population, 7.5 million people, we probably had the most talent and the most capacity to solve those problems. So now it's 3.5 or 4 years later. And unlike the performance of 4 or 5 years ago, here's where the city is. I had these charts that I brought with me, but I don't know what I did with them.
Here they are, right?
They're probably, where are they?
One of your staff is right.
Oh, there they are. That's great. It's like my speech. We can just get rid of that, and we can get rid of the chart. I have a pointer. This makes me feel like a teacher. Teachers don't have to run for office. It's much nicer being a teacher.
But we don't have such nice charts either.
Does he have to be sitting up here? This is the turnaround that's occurred in crime. One way to show it, one way to demonstrate it. This is the lowest level of crime the city has had since 1968. This was last year. This year, the level of crime is going to be even lower. So from a city that was setting records for homicide and for murder and for other kinds of crime that have reached some pretty high peaks at several different points in the last 3 decades, the city of New York has now had massive declines in crime. And the question is, I mean, why did that happen? There are any number of explanations for it, but I'm going to discuss 4 things and then one thing that lies ahead. And to me, if there's one principle that lies behind all 4 things that I'm going to discuss, the major reduction in crime in New York City, the substantial reduction in the number of people on welfare, the rather large increase in the number of jobs, and the turnaround in performance in the school system, which is beginning, there's one principle that lies behind each one of those major changes, and that is accountability. Accountability means a government that is willing to be measured, a government that is willing to set forth standards of performance so that other people can measure whether or not it has developed the correct standards and whether or not, according to those standards or others, it is achieving or it's failing. Government in New York City had, for most of the last 2 or 3 decades, been unaccountable, meaning no one really was measuring it. No one was really measuring performance. And when government becomes unaccountable, particularly government at a local level, which is a government about the delivery of services, even more than a state or a federal government, then there really is no performance to measure. Governments aren't businesses. Businesses have a fairly simple measure. It can be very complex what you do with this measure, but a simple measure of telling you whether you're going in the right direction or the wrong direction. You're either making a profit, a big one, a small one, or you are experiencing a loss. And welcome. And the fact is that governments don't have that kind of measure. So you have to build that kind of measure in. And the change that took place in the New York City Police Department is that every day crime is measured statistically. Every single day through the ComStat program in 76 different precincts, the city of New York registers, the police department registers the number of crimes that took place that day. So they can figure out every day what their performance at the end of the year is going to be. And then if problems begin to emerge, like there are an increased number of shootings, or there are an increased number of car thefts, or there are an increased number of property crimes, somebody can address that problem before it becomes much bigger, meaning not a year later or a half a year later, but the next day or the day after. It's essentially managing the police department the way you would manage a bank or a business with a lot of branch offices. If you managed a bank with 76 branches, every day you would get a profit and loss statement from the bank. Every day you'd get a sense of the amount of loans that were made. Were they profitable? Weren't they? After a week or so, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you would see branches that were going in the wrong direction, and then you would take management action to try to deal with that. And that is what is happening in the police department, and that's what accounts for this massive decline in this is overall crime. The decline in overall crime is 44%, the decline in homicide is 60%. But there's something else that occurs, and it is really the art of governing a local government, determining the right measure of success. The measure of success that gets you exactly at the point as to what the public expects politically from that unit of government or that subdivision. With the police department, it took a long time to arrive at it. Most people thought a police department was measured by the number of arrests that are made. A police officer that made a lot of arrests was a good police officer. A police officer that didn't was a lazier police officer. If you were going to promote police officers, you'd figure out how many arrests they made. But the fact is that arrests are one measure away from the political outcome that people really want from a police department. People don't want people arrested. They want no crime. They want a situation in which there's no reason to arrest people. So the real measure of success or failure is how much are you preventing crime? How much are you reducing it? So that has had an enormous impact on the reduction of crime in the city. And the rest of the crime charts I'm going to forget about because I already made that point. We can go to the next chart. The important thing about this, which gives you a sense of how the principle of accountability works, is what does the reduction in crime do for you? The reduction in crime means that you're actually vindicating the most important civil right that people have. Because before you can enjoy any other civil rights, you have to be alive, you have to be able to walk around a city not afraid to be beaten or mugged or raped or violated. You have to have a sense of at least a reasonable degree of personal security. I said that once in the first 3 or 4 weeks that I was in office as mayor. I said the most fundamental of civil rights is the sense of and the guarantee that government can give you of a reasonable degree of safety. And I was very heavily criticized by the people who used to run New York City government because they said I really didn't understand civil rights. I'm a pretty combative person, so when somebody says that to me, I usually respond. But I thought it really intellectually described the difference. The fact is that all the rest of the civil rights that we possess, the right to travel in interstate commerce, the right to a public education, all of that is meaningless if you're afraid to exercise those rights. And just in case you need a principled basis for it or something more fundamental than just my analysis of it, that's of course the guarantee in the preamble of the Constitution of the United States about guaranteeing the protection and guarantee of domestic tranquility. And if you sort of think even more basically about it, that's the reason people established governments even before there were big structures like national governments as we have today. This is the reason people banded together to offer protection for themselves against all the vagaries of life. And then once they could achieve that reasonable degree of security and protection, then they could move on to creating books and great art and other forms of endeavors and recognizing rights that existed between and among them. So in fact, as a city becomes more dangerous, then people are really losing their freedom and independence. And as the city becomes safer, what's happening, not just to individuals in the city who are saved from victimization, but what's happening to the spirit of a city is that more people are becoming, in a very real sense, free. They're becoming independent, not in just a theoretical way, which is interesting to discuss in school or in a city council chamber, but they're becoming free in society to make the choices they'd like to make about their lives. And that unleashes a spirit, a really wonderful spirit of people having a sense that they have more control over their lives. Now, the same thing is true in what has happened with welfare. New York City, 4, 5, 6 years ago, was seen as like a crime capital in America. And I remember being in London in 1990, and I was giving lectures on securities law, which are even more boring than whatever lecture I'm giving right now, if you can imagine anything that puts an audience to sleep more than the law of securities trading. However, during that discussion, after I finished it, all the questions that I got were about how dangerous is New York City really? And can you really come to the city of New York? And somebody showed me absolutely honest truth, a piece of paper about this big. It had 10 tips on how not to be the victim of a crime if you come to New York City, which is, of course, a great advertisement for somebody coming to a city. The fact is that in order to give people a sense of freedom and a sense of independence, you have to understand the direction that a city is moving in. The city of New York inexorably, and this actually goes back to before the 1980s, it goes back to the 1960s, was a city in which increasing numbers of people were dependent on the government to support them. And for the 4 or 5 years beginning in 1989, if you look at that chart, you will see a massive, massive increase in the number of people on welfare. There were two ways to view that. One way to view that is that meant that there were more people in need who were getting help from the government, and on a temporary basis, that's quite correct and quite necessary. But the longer-term way of viewing that, which the city wasn't doing, was this is an alarming thing to have happen to your city. This is an alarming and a kind of thing that should set off a bells and whistles that say, what are we going to do about that? Well, basically what was going on in the city of New York between 1989 and 1993 was to observe it, to watch people in large numbers, 100,000 more, 150,000 more, 200,000 more, 250,000 more people dependent on the government to support them. And this is a city in which we have a population of 7.5 million. When you start getting around 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 million on welfare, you're starting to increase the number of people that are dependent on the smaller number of people working to support them. And in addition to all of the other things that that can do to a society, what does it do for the individual? When a human being is supported by the state, the city, or another human being, it is very difficult for that human being, particularly if that happens over an extended period of time, to develop the kind of self-esteem and the self-worth that makes for a happy human being. So when you have a city that's moving in the direction of 100, 200, or 300,000 more people dependent on others to support them, you have a city that is moving toward more anger, more despair, more unhappiness. Now you reverse that, and you have a city in which large numbers of people are moving away from the necessity of having the government support them toward either completed or moving toward independence. And now you have a city that is moving toward more hope, more optimism, more of a sense that you can take control of your life and you are able to make choices about it rather than having someone else support you. Now, I have a lot of disputes and a lot of difficulties with parts of the federal welfare reform bill. I agree with some of it, I disagree with some of it, and I recommended to the president that he veto it. Not that he took my recommendation, but I'll tell you how we do welfare reform in New York City. It's far simpler. The way we do welfare reform in New York City has two very simple parts to it. Then it becomes very elaborate because we're dealing with over 1 million people. Now it's more like 850,000 people. We make sure that somebody is actually, honestly qualified for the benefits and isn't cheating or exaggerating. If you're qualified for the benefits, you get the benefits. Second thing we do is we say if you are able-bodied and you don't have very young children and you can't find a job, we will put you to work. We will find work for you. We have put now 200,000 people through our workfare program. And what they do is largely improve the quality of life for their fellow citizens. And that combination of the two things that I've talked about, accountability, measuring whether they are truly entitled, and restoring work as part of their lives, and keeping them in the workforce and constantly reinforcing the work ethic, has meant a reduction of 300,000 people on welfare and 200,000 people going through the work experience program. But there's something more basic than that. Those numbers tell about a major turnaround, maybe more significant than the turnaround on crime, but there's something much more basic about that. Unlike what the city was doing 4 and 5 years ago, now, thousands of times a month, hundreds of thousands of times now over 2.5 years, New York City reinforces the social contract. And the social contract says that if you want something, you have to give something. If you have a right, there's a duty that goes along with that right. If you get a benefit, there's an obligation that goes along with that benefit. And rather than being captured by the politically correct notion of what compassion means, I don't believe it's compassionate to have people supported by other people for long, long periods of time, sometimes going into a second and a third generation, and consider that you're doing something loving or caring or good for that person. I think, in fact, if you thought about it in terms of your family members, you would realize how thoughtless, in some ways, and how cruel that approach is. People should be given an opportunity to take care of themselves. People should be given an opportunity to realize what they can do for themselves. And people have to be kept in the workforce for as long as you possibly can, and return to the workforce as quickly as you can in order to reinforce both the social contract and the work ethic. If you let people drop out of the workforce for long, long periods of time, you take the risk that that's going to spread into the next generation and the one after that. And you also take the risk that you're going to do tremendous damage to their personalities, to their ability to feel good about themselves. So now we have a city that has introduced the principle of accountability into how we deal with welfare. And part of what has happened is that it has given more people freedom. People on welfare really aren't free. People on welfare certainly can't feel the personal fulfillment of being able to move toward taking care of themselves, and then the next step that gets beyond taking care of yourself is when you can take care of someone else. Then you can really feel self-fulfillment, whether a family or a friend or a neighbor. The third part of this is the turnaround in jobs, closely connected to the turnaround in welfare. The city of New York, between 90 and 93, had lost 320,000 jobs. Now, the creation of jobs, how a city loses jobs and how a city creates jobs, is even more complex than crime or welfare, because a city really doesn't employ people. People are employed largely in the private sector. Honestly, what a city can do, and if a city wants to take accountability for this, it can have policies and programs that encourage job creation, or it can have policies and programs that destroy job creation. And in New York City, we had a 40 to 50 year long history of having a political climate and a political acceptability that was very, very anti-business. The sense was that businesses were bad, that there was something less moral about pursuing a profit than being in a nonprofit institution, or there was something less moral about pursuing a profit than being in government. And it led to lots of manifestations of that in politics, which was burden business as much as you could. It was good politics. Everybody all agreed with that. And we ended up with a city that had the highest burden of taxation of any in the country and the highest burden of regulation of any in the country. And then we had something else that I learned about in my jobs before being mayor. We also had organized crime, which exacted its own tax, and that never even got to the government of the city of New York. So when I became mayor of New York City, I decided that we had to change that, and we had to change it abruptly. We needed to go through a period of time in which the mayor was not afraid to say, despite the political ramifications of it and the sense of political correctness that this was all wrong and this is a Republican saying this, felt the mayor of New York City had to say over and over again, New York City is now going to be a pro-business city, because being a pro-business city is to be a city that's pro-jobs. That if we can't keep businesses here and we can't attract businesses here, then all of the promises that we're making to poor people are absolutely phony promises, because government can't employ everyone. Government can't employ 7.5 million people. You need an atmosphere in which large, gigantic businesses, medium-sized businesses, and small businesses are going to provide jobs for people. And if we really mean that we want people to be free and independent, if we really mean it, then we want people to have jobs, because a job is better than any social program invented by the federal government, the state government, or a local government. And what that should mean in terms of sensible local government policy is to have policies that stabilize the businesses that you have and make your community, your jurisdiction, your city an attractive place to put a business. So at a time of grave fiscal concern, we cut taxes. We cut it modestly the first year because we couldn't afford to cut it as much as I would like. But I felt it was really important the first year that I was mayor to cut a tax, because nobody ever cut a tax before in New York City. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to cut a tax. And now I've actually set a record for cutting taxes, because I think I did with the first one that I cut. But now we have cut a lot of taxes, hundreds of millions of dollars, and returned that money to the private sector so that those businesses could stabilize. so that they could have more disposable income to rebuild their business or to employ more people. We've also done the very best that we could, but I have to honestly say we're no more than a third of the way through, if we are a third of the way through, trying to reduce the burdens of regulations. Instead of having 15 or 20 permits that you need, try to get it down to 1, 2, or 3. And we're working on that in order to accomplish it. And the third thing that we did was to try to take on organized crime in a really very aggressive way, particularly removing its influence from the carting industry, where we were able to put back in the hands of businesses another 3 to 4, maybe as much as 500 million, that could grow to over $1 billion in future years. All of that being done for the purpose of trying to readjust the balance between a government that was too large and a private sector that was too small, including the reduction of 24,000 government jobs, so that some of that money, so that in essence, if you think about the government being here and the private sector being here, and this kind of happening in the 4 or 5 years leading up to 1994, government getting larger, which is what was happening, government grew to its largest size in 1993, and the private sector was shrinking to its smallest since the Depression. What we've done is we've reduced the size of government and reinvested that in the private sector so that the private sector could start growing. The difference in numbers is we replaced a loss of 320,000 private sector jobs with a growth of 170,000 private sector jobs, restored a good many of the jobs that were lost. And each year, as the impact of these economic policies have an effect on the economy, the growth has gotten larger and larger. So that this year, the city of New York has its largest job growth in 13 years, which is part of the redefining of the city. Also, though, that has an impact on the spirit of the city. Just like with welfare, when you have a city that's losing 320,000 jobs, you have a city of despair. You have a city in which the general civic sense is one of people with their heads down, worrying about, well, what's the next job that's going to go? And are we going to be able to keep the mercantile exchange? And are we going to be able to keep the advertising industry? And are we going to be able to keep law firms here? And it creates a sense of civic despair. On the other hand, when you sort of put your finger in the dike and stop that, and people start to see growth, and they start to see new businesses coming in, and they see the mercantile exchange getting built in New York rather than leaving, now you start to see a spirit of hope and a spirit of optimism. And that's, I think, what lies behind the U.S. News & World Report cover of last week saying New York, comeback city. It's a city in which people feel a sense that there is a chance that not only they're going to get a job, but things are going to get better for them because they see that happening for other people. And the final area in which I'm going to talk about is education, because it's the most difficult of all, and it's the most important of all, because education has a massive impact on the future of a city. When I said the city of New York was a culture of unaccountability that is at some point moving toward a culture of performance, it isn't all the way there yet, but it's moving in that direction. It probably applies most to the public education system, which is huge and beyond the scale of any public education system in the country. A million students plus, over 1,000 schools. To have an impact on it takes a really remarkable degree of management and skill and leadership. And what we've been able to do in the last year is to introduce those principles of accountability into the education system that I was talking about before. The principles of accountability meaning we were able to change the law in the state for the first time in 28 years so that the person who runs the New York City school system, the chancellor, was given the opportunity to select the superintendents who run the 32 districts. Now, you can get a sense of why it was a system of unaccountability. Here, I select you to run the New York City school system, and I put you in charge of it, and you say to me, I'm going to change it, I want to improve it, I want to have reading scores go up, I want to have math scores go up, I want the schools to be safer, I want to see more children graduate, and I want to see less of a dropout. And I want to accomplish that over the next 5 years, and I'm going to start today by changing the ethos, changing the culture, changing some of the people, and then I say to you, oh, by the way, just one little problem with your job, you can't move anybody. Like they all have to stay there. And then you say to me, well, You mean the ones who haven't seen an improvement in reading scores for 10 years and their kids are reading less and less well and their math scores are going down and like crime is going up in their schools? I can't move them, and I would say that's right. Like, you have to make all these miraculous changes for me, but you can't touch anybody. They're all stuck there. And you have nothing to say about whether they're selected or not. Well, we changed that last year, and it's had a dramatic impact. The chancellor was given the power to remove corrupt and incompetent school boards, and the chancellor was given the power to select superintendents. What that meant was superintendents understood they were now accountable. When the chancellor called up before, they could not return the telephone call. Now when the chancellor called up, they better return the telephone call because next year they might be gone if they don't. And they began to understand that they were going to get measured by performance. Are the kids reading better? Are the kids adding and subtracting better? And if they're not, why not? And then one other thing that is enormously important, probably more important than even the CompStat program for the change in the city. And it's called, has a terribly technocrat kind of phrase, but it's enormously important and will have tremendous implications. It's called school-based budgeting. School-based budgeting means figuring out how much money it costs to run a school, which they never did before, which is really what made it totally unaccountable. They knew how much money it took to run the large system. That used to be like $7 billion, $7.5 billion, 8.5, now it's $9.1 billion. That's what it took to run the whole system. But nobody knew how much it took to run a school. And when you don't know how much it costs to run a school, but you do know how much it costs to run a whole system, the spending of money is wildly unaccountable. It has nothing to do then with performance. This chancellor, Rudy Crew, was brave enough to institute school-based budgeting. It took a year and a half. It meant going to each school and trying to figure out as best you can how much money is going to that school. And is there a correlation between performance and the spending of money? In some cases there is. In some cases there isn't any correlation at all between the two. And then figuring out, well, then how do we rectify that so we get children to add better, subtract better, read better? Those principles of accountability are now, for the last, I'd say realistically, for the last 10, 12 months, and maybe over the last 2 years, being introduced into the New York City school system. And you can see a change in performance. You can see a change in performance system-wide. This year, reading scores went up by the largest percentage in 10 years, and they went up in every district. Not nearly where they should be, but you have a sense of a system now in which accountability is being built into it, and the culture of unaccountability is being replaced with performance. So, what lies ahead? I think the thing that lies ahead for the city of New York, if it is to retain the gains that we've made in crime reduction and in moving people from the dependency of welfare to a life of independence, creating more jobs, and most importantly, turning around the school system, I think the biggest problem that lies ahead, that we've addressed in part, but as a city, state, and federal government have not addressed the way we should, is the whole problem of drug dependency and illegal drugs. I have the statistics here in the speech. They're absolutely startling. 60 to 70% of the people that are arrested and in jail or prison in New York City and New York State are involved with drugs. Many, many of our foster children who have to be taken away from their mothers and have to be taken away from their fathers when there are fathers are in homes in which there is significant drug dependency and sometimes drug crime. Neighborhoods have been brought back, but not enough of them. And the fact is that you're dealing again precisely with the same issue that you deal with when you allow too much crime, too many people to become dependent on the government, people not really to have jobs, and children not really getting the kind of education that they should get. You're dealing with precisely the same thing, which is robbing people of freedom and independence. A society in which an increasing number of people have the freedom and independence to make choices for themselves is a society that is progressive. It's a society that has a spirit of optimism. It's a society that can accomplish a great deal. A society that has increasing numbers of people that are becoming dependent in the most basic sense is a society that's deteriorating. And we have to face up to the problem of drugs, and we haven't done it as a society. We haven't done it because we still have myths and we still have romance about drugs. We haven't done it because it's a massive social problem. But I believe we are now in a position to really do it. I really believe that we are now in a position to take all of the cynics and all of the naysayers and all of the people who say you can't substantially and dramatically reduce the amount of drug dependence and do the same thing to them that we did to them on, well, if I were here 4 years ago and I told you that New York City would have 60% reduction in murder, many people would say, he's dreaming, he doesn't know what he's talking about. If I had ever said that there'd be 320,000 fewer people on welfare, nobody would have believed me. Absolutely nobody. And the fact is that we can do the same thing with drugs. If we do it sensibly, and if we do it wisely, and if we incorporate all of the things that can be done, and we introduce a principle of accountability into it. If we use law enforcement in a sensible way to arrest people who are drug dealers and to try to break up organizations and cartels that deal with drugs, and we put the resources into it, I can tell you, to the extent that we have done it, it has been hugely successful. I think about a community like Bushwick in Brooklyn. And I think about Bushwick because I remember Bushwick way, way back when I first ran for mayor in 1989. And I remember a woman being murdered there named Maria Hernandez. Maria Hernandez was murdered because she and her husband were trying to turn in the local drug dealers to the police because the local drug dealers, they feared, would give drugs to their children. And they did turn in the local drug dealers, and one night they came by her house and shot her and killed her and murdered her. And for several years, that community was in tremendous turmoil, in which, in fact, I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that the drug dealers were controlling the neighborhood. And when young children grew up, they saw the drug dealers as their role models, not decent, honorable people who could give children a sense of what they could be in their lives. Well, we started to turn that around in 1994 because we made a commitment to try to take every neighborhood back, block by block, from the street criminals and the drug dealers. We arrested a lot of people, a lot of drug dealers, a lot. We increased arrests for drug dealers by 55% in New York City in a short period of time. We invested enormous amounts of money in additional police officers. And we put a particular emphasis on the communities that had the worst problems. Now it's 3.5 years later. Murder in Bushwick is down 55%. Overall crime is down 50%. And Bushwick, which was featured in national magazines when Maria Hernandez was killed as one of the worst communities in the city, and one of the worst communities maybe in the United States, was featured on Nightline about 7 or 8 weeks ago as a model community for what can be done in an urban environment to bring that community back. Because all the problems aren't gone and all the drug dealers aren't gone, but the community is now controlled by the residents of that community, not by the drug dealers. And there are children able to walk around the streets, and there are children able to go to school, and there are businesses coming into the community, and it's in the middle of a turnaround. And that's the kind of thing that has to happen broadly. And the barrier that is stopping us from going to the next level is drugs. And the thing that could reverse much of what we've accomplished is if we don't address that correctly. And for that we need more intense, more effective law enforcement, but just as importantly, we need treatment programs that reach people. There's a sense that we have large numbers of people seeking treatment for drugs who are turned away for treatment. We don't. Most of the people who are treated for drugs are forced to be treated because they get arrested. We need to have large numbers of people seeking treatment for drugs, and we need to do things to produce that if we're going to turn around the problem. And we have to get to levels of understanding better how to conduct anti-drug education. I think some of it is done well, some of it is done very simplistically, and we really need to call on the federal government after having done our job more effectively. We have to call on the federal government to make this an important part of our foreign policy, rather than a secondary or maybe even tertiary part of our foreign policy. After all, it has to do with the future of our children, and it is just as important as international trade, and it's just as important as wars that may be going on in different parts of the world, because it has a lot to do with how productive America is going to be into the next generation and the generation after. And it's never been at that level at which it deserves to be. I think that's the challenge that lies ahead in the next 2 to 3 years. I think it's possible, using the same things that have been done with regard to all the things that I've talked about, to make enormous progress in reducing the number of people dependent on drugs. And I think that would be one of the most liberating and one of the most wonderful things that could happen to people in our cities, particularly the poorest people in our cities, because it may be the one barrier that still exists that will allow them to feel the full flower of what it means to live in a free and independent country. Thank you very much.
Mayor Giuliani has agreed to stay with us for 20 to 25 minutes of questions. Do we have just the 2 microphones tonight, or are there any up there? 1 up there, or 2? 2. So we have 4 altogether. The only ground rule we normally have is we ask each of you who have a question to really ask a question, not make a speech, so that the number of other people can have a chance to ask questions as well, and so that we can hear the speaker that everybody's come to hear, primarily. Also, if possible, we'd like the first question from each mic to be from a Harvard student. If there is one at the mic. If there's not one at the mic, we'll take whoever is first. Why don't you lead off?
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Will Monahan. I'm a junior at the college. I want to ask a hypothetical question. I spent the last summer in Washington, D.C., and as you know, there are lots of problems there. And let's say you're an advisor to the Congress and the President. What would you advise them to do with that city, with all its problems, the issue of home rule and so forth? And just in general, what would be your advice to the federal government as to what to do with the District of Columbia?
I'm now not going to make a joke, because if I do, I'll get into big trouble. I would advise doing all of the things that I'm talking about. I think you need a responsible government unit. The fact is that all the things that I've talked about can be done in Washington, D.C., and all the things that I'm talking about, maybe not all of them, but different things of equal value, are now being done in Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Indianapolis. Cities are truly at the core of being the most innovative governments in the country right now. And whether you accept that about New York City or not, I'm sure if you look around at the cities that I've mentioned, and Cleveland, I think about Cleveland because I just made a bet with the mayor of Cleveland on the Yankee-Cleveland Indian playoff. Among other things, if the Yankees win, he's going to send me perch. And if I win, I'm going to send him striped bass from the East River. But I think there are a lot of models. There are a lot of models of urban success now. There was I think it was Newsweek magazine did a cover about a year ago with Willie Brown and with me on the cover about how both cities have turned around, and then listed a group of other cities, some of which have had progress in different areas. Some have had more progress with their school system, some have had more progress with business and taxes, some have had more progress in the area of welfare, but there are a lot of models of urban success. And I believe that all of it comes down to what I was talking about before, accountability, willing to be measured. State your own measure of success, argue it, talk about it, discuss it. Other people can criticize it and think it should be something else, but at least you start moving a city toward performance and away from just rhetoric.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening, Mayor Giuliani. My name is Bradley Davis. I'm a sophomore at the college, and also on behalf of the Harvard Republican Club, I'd like to welcome you here to Harvard University.
There are Republicans here?
Oh, yes, sir. More than are willing to admit it.
Sounds like there are more Republicans here than in New York City.
Well, we'd be glad to ship him on up if you'd like. But, No, sir. My question, I guess, you stated that the role of a city and a local government in particular is the delivery of benefits to the citizenry. And we're living in an age in which governments, both federal, state, and local, are currently being downsized. And you mentioned that you'd cut 24,000 public employees from the city government. I was wondering how you felt that downsizing affected the delivery of benefits to the citizens.
Actually, I said the delivery of services, and it was different. I don't think government exists to deliver benefits. I think government has to give benefits when it's absolutely necessary in someone's life to give them benefits. And I think for every benefit that government gives, there has to be a countervailing obligation that the person entails when they get that benefit. Government delivers service, and local government delivers service, the most fundamental of which is safety. Public education is a fundamental service of local government. But I don't think governments exist necessarily to provide benefits, except when they're absolutely necessary. And the fact is, and this is, this would be the source of great debate, but I'm more than happy to debate it, the reduction in the workforce of New York City has made New York City more efficient. Nobody believed that when I first said it. Not everybody believes it now. My mother does. But most people, I think, most people would concede, even my worst critics, I think, would concede, that the reduction in the workforce has not made service worse. And I think most people would agree that service has improved. And there's a reason for that. It's not magic to it. New York City was out of control. We had too many people doing the same thing. We were like the worst form of the large American corporation that was employing too many people to do the same task and losing money and being outperformed by foreign corporations. So the downsizing of city government has had a good effect. It's required managers to ask the question, which is a very valuable question to ask in an out-of-control, oversized organization. How can I do more with less? How can I accomplish the same thing with 1/3 fewer people that I did with the rest of those people? And what you find is that you then get an honest answer. You start to get an accountable answer. You start to get an answer like, you actually can achieve more with 1/3 fewer people, or you can't, but then you can add some people back, but you don't have to add back the full 1/3. It's, again, taking a government that had become a vast monopoly that had no accountability and introducing the principle of accountability. Reducing the size of the workforce is really important to doing that. And in almost all of the cities that I've mentioned, you've had some form of that same kind of thing happening. New York, I'm not sure New York City was the worst example or one of the worst, but there is no necessary correlation between the number of people performing a service and the efficacy of that service. Either way, there are some services where you need more people, there are some services where you need less, but New York City existed on the assumption that if you had large numbers of people doing something, it would be done well. I'll give you a perfect example of that, and a very simple one and an easy one to state. It used to take 3 months to get your birth certificate from the city of New York. When we had about 40% more people doing it, it now takes 6 days to do it with fewer people, and we're trying to get it down to 4 days. And because we are now introducing principles of accountability. There are other things where I could find a different example where you do need more people. So I think that the two things don't necessarily correlate to each other.
Mayor
Sure,
Giuliani.
I can't see up there, so if you point, there you go, okay.
Mayor Giuliani, my name's Arkady Gurney. I'm a senior, and I'm from New York City. You said tonight that New York City suffered from a government that was too big and a private sector that was too small. But what does it say about the size of government and your administration that New York City children are learning in overcrowded schools and taking classes in hallways and basements and bathrooms?
What it says is that the city of New York, over a 15-year period, didn't build schools. And I can't do it all in 3.5 years. What you've left out of your analysis, which sounds a little like a political commercial, is that during the time... During the 4 years that I've been in office, we've built more schools and created more seats than any time in 30 years. First year I was in office, 17,000 new seats. That was the largest in 12 years. That I inherited largely from the prior administration, but carried it forward. Then the next year, 19,000 seats. That was the largest in 30 years. then 20,000, and this year 22,000. So since I've been mayor, we have produced 85,000 more seats for the New York City public school system. It would have been physically impossible to produce more than that. And honestly, what happened in the school system is, I'm more than happy to cast blame when I think it's deserved. What happened in the New York City school system is nobody anticipated the large growth in enrollment. And if I had that chart, I could show you that chart. The fact is that the New York City school system back in the late 70s was larger than it is today. It was like at 1.2 million. And the student population dropped to about 900,000. I may have the numbers a little bit off, but it's roughly like that. And then it stayed that way for about 12 years. So what New York City assumed was that there would not be a vast growth in enrollment. So it did not put in the capital dollars to build schools. Capital dollars take 4, 5, or 6 years to have an impact. And the city first really, then all of a sudden, in the late 80s and early 90s, the New York City school system that hadn't grown in 12 years started to grow at a rate of 16 to 22,000 students per year. And the first year that happened, I'm sure the mayor, probably back then Mayor Koch, may have been Mayor Dinkins, I'm not sure, probably said, well, this is going to happen for 1 year. No reason to now go build lots of new schools. Then it happened a second year. And then not only did it happen a third year, but people started to predict it's happening for the out years. And at that point, the city began then the plan to build more schools, which I have continued and escalated dramatically to try to catch up. That is what is going on. And most of it is driven by something else that you didn't mention, which is immigration, which is something that I want to encourage. It's a frustration, it's a difficulty, it's something we have to absorb and deal with intelligently. But most of the reason that the New York City school system is growing now at 16, 17, 18, 19, 20,000 students per year is that we have lots of people coming to New York City from all around the world. So I want us to deal with the frustration of that because I know that that drives us in a very positive direction. But that's what's going on. And over the next 2 to 3 years, if the city sticks with this capital building program that we have, we will be able to absorb most of this growth. And that is what is going on in the school system. And I think that it's a sensible way to try to deal with a very difficult problem. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mayor Giuliani, I'm Susan Thornton. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And my question is that there's an overall economic improvement in the country and crime is down across the country. Is there a way to separate out some of the specific things that you've done as mayor of New York to account for the changes in New York, or can they be attributed in a large part to the general changes across the country?
Well, some can. I think that the change in the economy has helped New York. New York, mayors, governors, even presidents don't ultimately affect the economy. They can do things that at the margin help or hurt. In a city, you can have policies that attract businesses or drive businesses away. But then you get benefited greatly when the economy is doing well, and you get hurt dramatically when the economy isn't. And no one political official or body can really affect the economy to that extent. I think the change in crime is dramatically different for New York than in the rest of the country. In fact, New York City has produced a large percentage of America's crime decline. Can I get my charts back? I'll show you the difference in a minute, if you have it. Well, never mind, we don't need the chart. The crime decline in New York City is 36, 37% in the first 4 years. It's probably going to get over 40%. There's no other city that is even roughly close to that. And the reason for that is that we're getting the benefit of what else is happening everywhere else, plus the programs that I talked about. During the debate between President Clinton and Senator Dole pointed out that for the prior year, New York City had constituted, I think, 35 to 40% of America's overall crime decline. So there are things that are happening in New York City that are different. The welfare reform program that's going on in New York City is not happening elsewhere. It is not the same thing as the federal welfare reform program. It started 2 years before it. By the time federal welfare reform had already been passed, we had already reduced the number of people on welfare by about 220,000. And in fact, I think it would have been a more sensible way to address the whole problem of federal welfare reform. So the answer is partially yes and partially no. Some of the things that are happening are affected by what's happening in the rest of the country. Some of the things that are happening because of things that are going on in New York City.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Giuliani. I wanted to ask you a question about something that doesn't appear to be on your agenda tonight, but is on the national agenda, and that is campaign finance reform. Some of us who followed your career in government and law enforcement were disappointed to hear that last week your campaign paid a $220,000 fine.
I was disappointed by that, too.
Yeah, I'm sure. They paid a fine for accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in contributions from people who had given past the more than the $7,700 limit allowed under New York City's campaign finance laws. Some of these same donors now seem to have been encouraged to instead give their money to Jules Polonetsky, who's your running mate this fall, or to the Liberal Party, which, like at the national level, is not subject to any caps on giving. Senator John McCain is going to be here a week from tonight, and he's going to be speaking about his bill that would ban soft money contributions, like the kind that the Liberal Party has been getting. His bill would ban those contributions at the federal level. Do you find the developments in your campaign at the local level at all disturbing, and do you think you or your campaign could abide by a strengthening of New York City's campaign finance law to include McCain-Feingold soft money restrictions?
Well, actually, New York City's campaign finance law is far stricter than the federal campaign finance law.
Right.
And
Could it be strengthened to ban soft money?
It does ban soft money.
Well, obviously, the Liberal Party has been getting money from your contributors.
That isn't what soft money is about. Soft money is about what happens to that money. The Liberal Party can raise all the money that it wants. The issue is, what does it then do with that money?
And none of that money has been spent on your campaign?
Well, then I have to account for it.
Okay.
If they use that money in my campaign, I have to and I've gone through 2 elections under the campaign finance law, then I have to account for how they're using that money. And same thing is true with the Republican Party. I run as a candidate of 2 political parties, Republican and Liberal. Both of them do things to assist my candidacy, and both of them do things to assist all of the other candidates that are running on the ticket. And I have to make an allocation for how they're benefiting me. And then that allocation is audited. And if I haven't allocated enough, then I have to put more money into that. And that's the way in which soft money is dealt with in the city of New York. For example,
but the phenomena seems to be in New York that people have been giving, people who do business before the city have been giving the $7,700, and then when they've maxed out, they then are approached by the Liberal Party and give $30,000 in some cases to the Liberal Party.
no, the fact, no, but the fact is that people that would give to my campaign would also be very likely to give money to my running mate's campaign. That would make sense, and to the political parties that support me. You're never going to stop that. That makes sense. If I support a candidate, I probably support their running mate, and I probably support the political party that they are part of. The issue is, how is that money then used? Is that money used for the 20 other people that are running on the Republican line, as well as this particular candidate, or is the money used as just a secret way of helping that particular candidate? All of that is open to audit. All of that is open to analysis. If I open a campaign office with other Republican candidates, for example, I have to pay for my share of that office. And that comes out of my campaign finance limit of $10 or $9.7 million. Or, for example, if I do it, there's a candidate for borough president in Staten Island, Guy Molinari. He's a Republican candidate. He's the incumbent borough president. He and I have ran together twice before. We're going to run together for a third term. Let's assume for a moment that he and I do a political ad together. He appears in my ad, and I appear in his, and he says, I think Giuliani is doing a great job, vote for him. And I say, I think Molinari is doing a good job, vote for him. I have to pay for part of that ad. And if I make the wrong calculation, if I end up paying for a third of the ad, but I appear in the ad 50% of the time, the Campaign Finance Board is going to require me to put the additional percentage in. Now, the issue that you're talking about with the money that came out of the campaign involves a very, very esoteric and difficult rule to analyze, and that is what constitutes control of a corporation. It was the belief of all of the lawyers in my campaign that control of a corporation, the rule was you had to own 51% of the stock in order to have control of the corporation. The Campaign Finance Board's interpretation, which did not exist in the first two elections that I ran in, was that if 2 or 3 people together equal 51% of the stock, they should all be treated as one person. And that's most of the money that had to be returned. The lawyers running my campaign believed that their interpretation was correct. The Campaign Finance Board believed their interpretation was correct. All of the money was returned, and they charged us a fine because they believed we should not have taken the money. But that's what the dispute was about.
Thank you. My name is Justin Steele. I'm a sophomore at the college. I worked in the court system this summer and saw indigent clients who I believe were innocent go to jail because police officers lied and there wasn't sufficient investigative or defense support to give them good representation in the face of a system stacked against them. You've consistently cut funding for the Legal Aid Society and other public defenders and given contracts out to competitive bidders who are of a lower quality and make a profit by assigning more cases to defense attorneys. I think most defense attorneys in New York now have more than 100 cases, 100 felonies at a time, compared to a prosecutor's 30. Do you feel that this is the representation that indigent clients in New York City are entitled to? And do you have any
I think I've
plans to change
improved
that?
the representation for indigent clients in New York City by introducing competition. The Legal Aid Society had become a monopoly, meaning it wanted to control all cases for all indigent clients. It is my view that any monopoly, government, private, or semi-government, semi-private, becomes ineffective, inefficient. It tries to put its interests ultimately ahead of the interests of the people that it serves, which was illustrated by the fact that they wanted to go on strike, which for lawyers, to me, is always a very kind of strange thing, that lawyers want to go on strike. Going on strike means that you don't represent your clients. They remain in jail. They stay in jail for long periods of time. And it seemed to me that the city should not be at the mercy of any organization without having alternatives. So what I did was I put out some of the contracts for competitive bidding and allowed other organizations of lawyers to develop that could compete with the Legal Aid Society to represent indigent clients, which is, to me, a much healthier way to deal with services for indigents, because the Legal Aid Society or any other organization, we're a very, very large city. We're talking about thousands and thousands of cases. They should not have control over that business to the extent of becoming a monopoly. And it says nothing particular about the Legal Aid Society. The same thing happens to a business that gets like that or a government agency. And I believe over time it will improve their performance to have to compete for providing services to indigents.
I'm up.
No, I think it's...
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting up there.
Why
I'm
don't we
sorry.
just take two more questions, one from each of you. We'll make a second round and complete it, and then Mayor Giuliani's schedule requires that we will break at that point.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. My name is Ryan Piscobble. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School of Government and a lifelong resident of Queens. Wanted to ask you what your position was on the Constitutional Convention referendum coming up in November and how you saw that affecting the future of New York City.
No one's asked me that question but once in the last 4 months. I think New York needs a constitutional convention. I think that I will probably vote for it. I will vote for it. I was going to say I don't know how it will turn out, whether or not there'll be enough votes for a constitutional convention to take place or not. But I think that New York needs one. I think New York state government needs to be rethought. I think it needs to be reinvented. And I think that the delays in the budget and the other things that have happened really suggest that you should take the risk. Now, there are a lot of people very afraid of it on both sides. There are a lot of people on the more conservative side and the more left-wing side who are very frightened of having a constitutional convention because they think one side or the other will control it. But it seems to me that this would be a very healthy thing for the state to go through this kind of debate and reanalysis of precisely how they can improve their form of government.
As a follow-up, sir, do you believe that the people who will fill the Constitutional Convention will be average citizens, or will they be politicians and
My understanding
political
of
staff?
how it happened, and one of my very close friends, former first deputy mayor and now chairman of my campaign, was worked at the first or the last constitutional convention in New York, which was back in the 1960s. The fact is, the way I think it's filled is you elect 3 delegates per Senate district. So here's the reason for the fear. The Senate is controlled by Republicans, but by a very, very slim margin. So the fear is that the Constitutional Convention will be controlled by Republicans, so people who think that the Republicans will do damage to certain established rights or whatever fear a Constitutional Convention. But since it's 3 per Senate district, the fact is that the last Constitutional Convention was not controlled by Republicans. And there's a very good chance, and everybody gets a chance to contest. For example, there's a Senate district on the east side of Manhattan. It's represented by Roy Goodman, who is a very good friend of mine, a political leader that I work with, and I think one of the best representatives anywhere, any place. But it would be very, very unlikely that in that Senate district you would elect 3 Republicans. Roy Goodman is the only Republican who could probably get elected in that Senate district. I shouldn't say that. I'm going to get into a lot of trouble saying that. I get elected in that Senate district also. But that's a district in which the registration is 60, 65% Democratic, maybe 70% Democratic, I don't remember. Unless you have a really exceptional candidate like Roy Goodman, by and large, a Democrat's going to get elected there. So I think their political calculation is wrong. I think a convention would end up being end up being politically balanced. I'd almost guess that it would be slightly balanced in favor of Democrats, even though most Democrats disagree with this completely. And I think it would be a good thing to have that kind of debate and discussion about how we should modernize New York State government.
Thank you.
Last question.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. My name is Jacqueline Newmeyer, and I'm a freshman from Washington, D.C., and I want to thank you for being here on behalf of the Harvard-Radcliffe Republican Alliance. And my question is whether you support the President's proposal for national education testing standards and whether national testing would be in keeping with your mantra of accountability.
Well, I think that the idea of higher standards is a very good idea. The chancellor of the New York City school system, Rudy Crew, who I turn to for advice on this, is concerned about whether national testing would be a good thing or a bad thing. He thinks in certain areas it would be good because you could have objective tests that would be fair for the entire country, particularly in the area of math scores, and he has more concern about reading scores. And I mean, I'd have to really see how they would establish this. I mean, I'm generally not in favor of big, large national bureaucracies. Education is a local function. I think if the standards were very general standards, if they were used as guideposts, it could probably be helpful. If they started to get into the minutiae of trying to measure every aspect of education, and we started to build a larger and larger and larger national bureaucracy, it could get very dangerous. So I guess really the devil here is in the details. If we're talking about very generalized standards that apply very broadly, then I think it could help. If we're talking about really trying to, in essence, micromanage local education, it could be very, very damaging. And I'd really have to see how this all plays out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. That's been great. That was terrific. If I were in New York, I'd love to. I welcome you back. I enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. It's amazing, you know, how aware. Yeah, no, it's a terrific thing.
Would you be able to sign for me?
Sure, I'd be happy.
Born and bred New York City.
I'm also going to get his autograph now. I have a different. It's an American League baseball.
All right, the only kind.
Yeah.